It's a pleasure to be here today. And my job is to talk a little bit about failure in criminal justice. And my remarks are based on a project that I've been working on for the past 3 years with the help of the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the Department of Justice. The BJA and my organization, Center for Court Innovation, have come together to launch what we call a policy inquiry looking at failed criminal justice experiments. And to be clear, when we talk about failure in this context, we're not talking about failures of corruption or malfeasance or misconduct. We're talking about projects where a bunch of smart, intelligent, dedicated, noble people got together to try something grand and fell short of their goals in one way or another. And there are really kind of 3 operating assumptions that led us to embark on this line of inquiry. The first is, to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt, that there's no effort without error. And that's just a reality that we should acknowledge. The second operating assumption is that it's human nature not to want to talk about that so much. That error is typically only talked about in hushed whispers or over a beer at the end of the day. And I think our third operating assumption is that, in fact, other fields, and Kevin mentioned one of them, science, do a lot better job of talking honestly about the trial and error process than criminal justice system does. The example I like to use is that Eli Lilly and Company was famous for many years for convening failure parties for their scientists who did great scientific work, even if it failed to lead to new products for the company. And I think it's fair to say that the typical police chief or prosecutor or court administrator doesn't feel like he or she has that kind of latitude. And what we're doing with this project is in some modest way trying to push the field in a direction where it's even conceivable that a police chief might convene a failure party. So what I want to do real quickly in the 6 minutes I have left is to highlight 4 lessons that we've learned that I think are relevant not just to the field of criminal justice but to other fields of endeavor as well. Lesson number 1, failure is often in the eye of the beholder. I think that we tend to, in this country to take a pass-fail approach to social programs. Does something work or does something not work? And I think that most of us in this room would probably agree that the closer you look at programs, the harder it is to make those kinds of assessments. And in the world of criminal justice, we often like to say that instead of saying something works, the best we can say is that some programs work for some people some of the time. And this was a lesson that was really driven into my skull most recently in relationship to a program that my agency runs called the Harlem Reentry Court. And this is a reentry program that's working with parolees returning to Harlem after a bid in state prison. And during the first 6 months of their parole term, we provide them with very intensive supervision and access to a whole range of services that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And the goal is to try to reduce crime and reduce incarceration among this population. And so researchers recently looked at this project and tracked the performance of parolees in the program for 3 years post-program. And what they found was that on the first question, did the program reduce crime? The answer was yes. That parolees who participated in the reentry court were 19% less likely to be rearrested or re-convicted of a new crime. So, hooray, right? That's great news. The bad news is that we had actually increased the rate of prison returns, and because of what's called in the business a supervision effect, we were picking up a lot of technical violations of parole. Dirty urines, missed appointments, missed curfews, broken curfews. And so here's a project that reduced crime, but also didn't have an impact on incarceration. Is that a success or a failure? The bottom line is, in this case, research didn't provide us with an easy, bright line answers. And I don't think that that's an exception in the world of criminal justice. Lesson number 2. Things fall apart. Just because something works once doesn't mean it will work forever and ever. The best example of this in my line of work is a project called Operation Ceasefire, which is kind of one of the most wonderful criminal justice interventions of the past generation, which was credited with the so-called Boston Miracle of reducing teen homicide in Boston in the 1990s by as much as 63%. And this is a project that achieved a level of success that very few projects ever achieved. Trips to the White House, uncover Newsweek magazine, millions of dollars of grants. I could go on and on and on. In the midst of its success, as the 90s came to an end, it fell apart. Why did it fall apart? One of the strengths of the project was that it was a collaboration among probation and police and clergy and street outreach workers and academics from Harvard. And it turns out it's enormously difficult to maintain interagency collaborations over the long haul. And I want to read just one quote from one of the participants in Ceasefire, an outreach worker who wrote an op-ed as the teen murder rate in Boston started to kind of go through the roof again. And he wrote, "Suddenly fame started getting into people's heads. A decade ago, a young man in Dorchester told me, 'You adults are the real gang members, easy to feel slighted, fighting petty beefs, vying for attention and credit. It is the beefs on the streets that get the headlines, but it's the beefs in the offices and the agencies that are to blame for what is happening now.'" So I think that managing egos and managing politics with a small p are incredibly important to any reform effort, and we should acknowledge that. Lesson number 3, context matters. Just because something works in one place doesn't mean it will work in other places. One of my favorite singers is a guy named Billy Bragg, and he has a song in which he says, "You can borrow ideas, but you can't borrow situations." And I think that really rings true to me. And we learned this most powerfully when we looked at the drug court model. Drug courts, like Ceasefire, one of the more important criminal justice interventions of the past 25 years. These are programs that link addicted offenders to long-term drug treatment in lieu of incarceration, and then use judges to kind of rigorously monitor people's progress in treatment. And study after study, including some studies by great researchers here, have been documented that these programs can succeed in reducing both substance abuse and recidivism. But that doesn't mean that every drug court is a success, of course. We looked at drug courts in 2 cities, Denver and Minneapolis, that struggled mightily. And when we kind of dug into it, what did we learn? Why did they struggle mightily? There's lots of reasons, but one big one is that they took a turn for the worse when the originating judges, 2 charismatic judges in each place, who founded the drug courts in Denver and Minneapolis, moved on to other assignments. And I think that this underlines that leadership transitions are very, very important moments in the lives of social programs, and that we really need to, if we're going to succeed in changing systems, we really need to build programs and institutions that are not reliant on heroic individuals. Final lesson, lesson number 4, is the seductive power of unrealistic expectations. And I think that this is the biggest challenge that criminal justice reformers face, and that is that there's a tremendous mismatch between what they're expected to achieve and what they can realistically achieve. The criminal justice system is a multi-headed beast, and boy, is it impervious to change. And on a micro level, individuals who find themselves enmeshed in the criminal justice system bring a whole host of problems with them to the criminal justice system. And I don't have to catalog them, addiction and mental illness and joblessness and histories of abuse and dysfunction. Changing their behavior is really, really difficult work. But we don't often communicate that to the public or to elected officials. All too often we communicate the reverse, which is that we're going to magically transform people's lives and communities. And I really worry about that. And one example that occurs to me is the Second Chance Act, this kind of rare, beautiful piece of bipartisan legislation that was signed into law in 2008, which, among other things, supports reentry programs like the Harlem one that we operate. And embedded in the legislation is the expectation that programs that get federal dollars are going to achieve 50% reductions in recidivism among participants. So we talked to Joan Petersilia, who's one of our foremost criminologists, and asked her about this. And she said this: "There is nothing in our history of over 100 years of reform that says we know how to achieve recidivism by more than 15 or 20%. And to achieve those rather modest outcomes, you have to get everything right. The right staff, deliver the right program at the right time in an offender's life, and in a supportive community environment. We just have to be more honest about that. We've assumed that we would not win public support with modest results." And so this is a failure trap that I feel, I can only speak for criminal justice, that we in criminal justice stumble into over and over again, of kind of over-promising and under-delivering. And I think that when we do that, it just breeds public cynicism with government. And that's why I feel like conversations like the one we're having today are so enormously important, because when we talk honestly about how difficult it is to promote change within large public bureaucracies, I think we push back against public cynicism in government. So, thank you. I guess my visceral reaction is that I'm kind of studiously middle ground, and that we're my agency. I should back up and say 2 seconds about the agency that I run. It's called the Center for Court Innovation, and we have it's a non-governmental organization that's forged a unique relationship with the New York State court system, where they essentially hire us to function as their independent research and development arm. And in that capacity, over the past 10 to 15 years, we've created 18 different demonstration projects in New York City, each of which is testing a new approach to a different problem within courts, within the criminal justice system. And our approach is really we value demonstration, and we're not trying, along the way we're trying to change individual lives, but we're not so much focused on the individual, and nor are we trying to radically transform in one fell swoop the entire criminal justice system. We have found it much more useful to try to fight off a specific problem. Youth crime in Harlem, domestic violence in downtown Brooklyn, the problems of mentally ill, serious and persistent mental illness among felony offenders in Brooklyn. And that's kind of the level that we've found it most helpful to work at. Well, I guess it's funny to write a book about failure in the criminal justice system at this particular moment in history, because in some respects we're living through the golden moment in terms of criminal justice, in terms of crime reductions in this country. And I think that we could certainly point to the transformation of policing over the past 25 to 30 years as a real example of success and how the field has responded and adapted in a way to findings from research and moved from riding around in cars and responding to 911 calls versus actually reaching out and enforcing low-level crime in different ways. But I don't think that we should, just because we've had success in the field of policing, I don't think we should underestimate the disconnect that exists between research and practice in the field. And I just wanted to share one anecdote from my life, which was, I hope this doesn't end up competing with it, but one of the lowest moments I had speaking at a conference. I organized a panel at a conference of Chief Justices many years back, I brought together a panel of researchers to talk to the 50 Chief Justices in the country. And one of the researchers, who's someone you all may know, gave a presentation about drug court findings. And along the way, and was making the point that drug courts work, right? But along the way, talked about, 50 to 60% of drug court participants end up failing, don't succeed. And you would have thought that there was going to be a riot in the room. People were so upset. And what they heard was not that drug courts were a success, but that it was a failure, in fact. And what that said to me was, and here are 50 people who run complicated public institutions, who have, by and large, gone through our best schools, and they were not used to hearing directly from the source findings from social science, and they didn't know how to respond to it. And I think that that's a real challenge for the field of criminal justice. I don't know whether that maps onto it. Well, again, I can't. That's not the level at which I'm trained to think, for better or for worse. That's too abstract for me. And I'm much more of a concrete person who understands, what's happening in Brownsville, what's happening in Brooklyn, and the big picture. But I would say that the big picture is really comprised of a mosaic. And I guess I proceed under the assumption that if you can change Brownsville, if you can change Brooklyn, if you can change New York City, if you can change New York State, you end up having an impact on these larger concerns that you're talking about. And when you look at the big picture, as you just have laid out, of course, we have a horrible problem of kind of over-incarceration in this country. But back to my earlier point that not every place is the same, that's not a universal, in fact, in every place. And one of the things that I think is a story that's relatively untold in the policy world is that, and I just keep coming back to New York because that's where I'm from, New York has actually managed to reduce crime and incarceration over the past 10 to 15 years. But I don't think we're learning from that. I don't think we're spreading that model throughout the states. And I think that we need to do more of that. But the big picture is made up of actually a bunch of little pictures. No, I don't think there's any doubt that we have people in jail and prison that don't need to be there. And I think that it's also the case that incarceration exists for a reason. There are some people that are dangerous and deserve to be there. And I think that we need to be much more, make much more finely tuned judgments. The line, I can't remember who originated it, but I think it's the one that strikes a chord with me, is that we need to really make a distinction between people that we're just mad at and people that we're scared of.
Phil Hyman.
And I don't think that
Phil Hyman said it.
Phil Hyman. I don't think we do a